when you are thinking about writing a sex scene in, you have to ask yourself why. Is this just the natural, does it fit naturally into the rest of your story? Is there something meaningful there that you hope will lead, a reader to feel a certain way that is also still relevant to your story? If you have to ask yourself kind of like, okay, should I add a sex scene? You probably don't. It really should just come naturally, just like any other scene should. Now it is now the problem comes when it does come up naturally and you're not prepared for it. There was one writer who there are actually two authors that I could think of that were really good examples. They were talking on the forum about the sex that they want, or the sexual nature of their books. One writer in particular had a science fiction novel, and a very big part of that is, procreation for the sake of procreating. Obviously sex is involved, but it's between two different types of species, and one particular species, the men have very oddly shaped penises, something to that effect. And in terms of implantation with women, human women, she wanted to explain it in a way that you know wasn't going to be sexual in nature. So that was an example of something where, you are going to be writing out a sex scene, but it doesn't necessarily have to be erotic. You could still talk about, the alien's penis. You could still talk about the woman's vagina, how it feels to her. And I'll talk to you either in this video or the next video about how you're going to actually do that. But I just want to give examples of how other authors have struggled to add sex scenes but not make it overly erotic, where it makes their readers feel uncomfortable. You don't want to leave it out because, quite honestly, as a reader, I'd be curious. But there are techniques that we can learn that can help you approach that situation in a way that's not too exploitative or too overly erotic. So that's one example. Another example that I've noticed is when we talk about sexualized topics. So one writer that I noticed, she brought up a question of adultery. And, she had mentioned that she's writing a book about adultery. But then she went on to explain that the book is about a woman who's involved in a very emotionally abusive relationship with her husband. And she seeks solace in another lover. So she didn't want the book to be about adultery. And she didn't want to be, that kind of, too trashy, steamy sexy. And don't get me wrong, those kinds of books can be hot. And there are readers for them, but that wasn't where she was going. She wanted to take another approach. And so I explained to her, well, you've already told me what the book is about. The book is about somebody who's in an abusive relationship who seeks solace with another lover. It's not so much about adultery, it's about this woman who is trying to, liberate herself, emotionally free herself from what is obviously a very destructive and very toxic relationship, and her outlet right now is just to be with another person. And, as a writer, that can be very inspiring just to think about it in that sense, because then you start to not focus on the sex so much, but now you start to think about the emotional aspects of relationships and the way that we depend on other people. I don't know what that writer is going, the author was like, yeah, that's right. That's what I'm working on. That's what I have to focus on. And if you keep that intention in mind and you make sure you write your story with that intention in mind, it should attract the audience that you're looking for. Readers who can empathize with the protagonist in this particular case. But you could see how if you just kind of shift your intentions, you don't necessarily have to think of a sex scene as being erotic. And this is what I've talked about previously. It really is just about being comfortable with sharing that particular topic. And so one way of becoming comfortable with it is just to shift your focus. Focusing less on the sex itself or what it suggests, and focusing more on, the context, the emotional component, the psychological component, the mental component, and less about the physical.